What is the creepiest family secret you have discovered? Serious. My grandmother was addicted to those speed diet pills in the late 1960s and had a collection of wigs that she used to impersonate other people to pick up their prescriptions. The story: she had gone through a lot in life by that point. Her mother died when she was 6, and her dad remarried 6 months later to a woman who used to starve her and only let her eat leftovers. She married at 17 to a man in his late 30s to just get out of the house. Her husband, my grandfather, committed suicide in 1961 when my mum was only 1 year old, leaving her alone with very little money and 4 kids. She had wigs because she lost her hair in the aftermath of her husband dying from stress. She still had them when I was a kid in the 90s and I used to wear them for fun, although I didn't learn about their true purpose until a long dinner on a family holiday many years later. She told her entire life story from the start and every detail has stuck in my mind. She stopped the pills cold turkey when she saw the police at the house of one of her neighbors, one of the women she'd been impersonating. It scared her straight. To look at her later in life, you would never have guessed she went through anything. The diet pills weren't even the end of it. She had a rough time with the menopause later on, got pregnant in the early stages, which then sent her a bit off kilter and she was sectioned because she kept sticking her head in the oven and the doctors didn't properly understand why at the time. Full stop. She was the sweetest little old lady you'd ever meet, although she had a wicked dry sense of humor. All of my best memories growing up were with her. I was always the awkward weird gay kid and she let me be myself, be creative, dress up. She was honestly my best friend. She died surrounded by her family in 2014 in her 80s. My aunt is still addicted to those speed diet pills and travels over state lines to get them. 8 hours round trip, 4 hours in a waiting room. To be fair, she is overweight, but she's been on them for like 15 years and only takes them now to feel normal. It's pretty fricked. A few years ago, one of my dad's cousins did one of those DNA kits. A few weeks later she was contacted and told that there was several close relatives in their database that aren't listed on the family tree she made. It turns out that my great-grandfather faked his death in a life insurance scam and then started a new family on the other side of the country. He never got in contact with my great-grandmother or his children with her, my grandfather and his sister. It kind of crazy because he only passed away a few years before this all came to light. My grandma and her 9 siblings are very close, so when they each got a call saying a family member had died and they had inherited a large sum of money, they thought it was a scam. Turns out their very strict and religious father had a secret affair and an additional child, Marie. Well, Marie, now in her 80s, had passed away, so had her husband. They had no children, so the closest relatives were my grandma and her siblings. And that's how 10 religious people in their 70s and 80s learned their dad had cheated on their mom and they had a half-sister they never got to meet. Oof, that must really suck. My great-grandmother most likely put a hit out on my great-grandfather. My great-grandma married my great-grandpa and had a beautiful tan brown-haired girl. Then my great-grandma gave birth to a blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl. Shortly after, my great-grandpa was found murdered in his truck on the side of the road. He used to give the immigrants rides to work and the police stated that one must have robbed and killed him. The problem was he was found with his wallet, money and all his belongings. He was also known as a kind, caring man who was well liked. My great-grandma was known as the opposite. Shortly after he was murdered, she married his best friend, a blonde hair, blue-eyed man. Bonus creepy thing: her first daughter, my grandma, was a strict Mormon who had inherited some of her mother's disdain for children and general displeasure of happiness. When she passed, we were going through her belongings, mostly church records and clothing, only to find a box full of papers on witchcraft and specifically witchcraft of our town. Disdain for children and general displeasure of happiness. Words to live by, my friend. My mom told me this over dinner a few years back like it was no big deal. When I was 6, my grandma mother's side wanted me to sleep over at her place for the weekend. It's noteworthy that she never really liked me. I remember her as a cold witch, 6-year-old brain. Her housekeeper was nicer to me than she was. My mom said no, she wouldn't let me sleep over at her mom's. Granny got really angry, saying something along the lines of "you will regret this." So she didn't hear from her for a while and went to the house to check up on her. Granny had suicided herself with sleeping pills. Here is where it gets creepy. My mom found her diary and her last entry with things like, granddaughter, me, is rotten, needs to be killed and it's her job to do so. My name was in her calendar for that weekend. Basically my grandma wanted to kill me when I was 6. I'm really glad my mom trusted her gut and said no to the deadly sleepover. My dad once found a mummified human foot just chilling in a trunk in his basement. My grandfather was an orthopedic surgeon who was stationed in New Guinea during World War II and by all accounts was never quite the same after the war. Our best guess regarding the foot is that it belonged to one of his patients and either had some sort of abnormality my grandfather found interesting, or he was just super proud of the amputation job he did. My dad and his buddy, who were 12 or 13 at the time, naturally decided that the best course of action was to hang the foot from the front porch of the girl they were crushing on, and apparently no one in town batted an eye over it other than thinking it was a good prank. And that, kids, is how I met your mother. That my grandpa was a drug addict and was eventually cast out of the family. My aunt woke up one night to find him in the house, talking to a real estate agent. He snuck in and tried to sell their house while they were asleep. He also double mortgaged their house, so he got basically all my nan's income. When my nan tried to move the family away from him, she realized she had almost no money due to this. Bank director said it was okay because men are supposed to control the bank account. She was stuck there because of him, and he was leeching off their money and there was nothing she could do about it. My cousin Eric died of AIDS-related cancer. He never told anyone about a partner, and he died essentially with no contact with anyone outside of his family. I was maybe 8 when he passed and I don't think I met him more than once. He was only in his 20s. It always makes me sad to know that there were, so many men and women who died alone because of the AIDS crisis in the 80s. My grandfather from my mother's side died way before I was born. I was always told that he fell off the balcony and died. A year or 2 ago I found out what really happened. When I was I think 13, my mom was telling the story to my uncle's girlfriend while my mom, uncle's GF and me, we're sitting at the table. I was just minding my business, while my mom was whispering to my uncle's GF. At some point I heard my mom tell something about her dad, and I started listening to what she was saying. She explained that her dad was an alcoholic, and could be pretty abusive at times. When he got drunk, he would sometimes threaten to kill himself. On the night before my mom's birthday, after he put her and her siblings to bed, he got drunk and threatened to throw himself off the balcony. He stood on the edge of the balcony, on the other side of the fence thing. Can't remember what it's called in English. Sorry. My grandma tried to calm him down, and to get him safe inside. It worked. My grandfather calmed down, but instead of getting inside, he accidentally let go of the fence and fell off the balcony. He probably thought that if he landed in a correct way he wouldn't break too many bones or something, so he tried to move while in the air. It didn't work, and he died. So yeah, when my mom woke up the next morning, on her birthday, her father was dead. Some details may be wrong. It's been, like I said, a year or 2 ago since I heard this story, and frankly I'm too timid and kinda scared to ask my mom the whole story again because it'll always be a sensitive topic. The fence thing. On a balcony, it's usually called a railing. On a staircase, it's called a banister. Also, it could be called a handrail in either case. Fence is pretty close, though, not the usual word, but close enough to get the meaning across. My father's parents both died in the 90s. Around 5-10 years ago I did a 23andMe test, mostly for kicks and to look out for any health issues. Last year I was contacted by someone through the service who was trying to find blood relatives because both of her parents had been adopted as infants, and we had a pretty strong genetic connection. Long story short, my grandfather had an affair in the 1950s and fathered twins. My aunt and uncle were pretty floored to find out they have half-siblings. My father died 4 years ago from suicide, so he never knew. To get even weirder, my mother grew up with these twins after they had been adopted. She was friends with my father's half-siblings decades before she married him. My grandfather had a little crazy aunt who lives in the attic. His father's sister had some sort of mental illness, and they were apparently worried about how they would look for the family. So they locked her in the attic of his boyhood home Jane Eyre style and basically just kept her fed and otherwise ignored her. I found out about this when he briefly mentioned it a few years ago, like it was an entirely normal thing to do with a family member. That is unbelievably cruel. My grandma had 6 children. I always thought my oldest uncle looked and acted different from the rest of the siblings. When I was 24 I found out he didn't share the same father as the rest of them. But that isn't the juiciest part. His real dad is my grandpa's brother. Uncle Father Oscar. My grandpa, my mother's father, killed his first wife. My great-grandmother tried to kill my grandma, my mom's mother, several times when she still was a child. My mom had an affair with her sister's husband. My dad got killed because of a wrecked car. I always thought I was born of an affair between my parents, who were both married to other people at the time. Last year, my grandmother told me that in fact, my dad and his first wife wanted a son, but had a daughter. They tried to buy my mom's son, my older half-brother, from her, but my mom wouldn't sell. Instead, they agreed to give my mother $10K to have another baby. The deal somehow fell through after my dad had gotten my mom pregnant. My dad went to prison and got divorced from his first wife, and the first wife tried to steal me from the hospital. Maybe more sad THSM creepy. My great-grandfather died in a mental institution. However, everyone who asked was told he died in prison, because it was less shameful in the 30s than being crazy. That is sad. Hope whatever exists after death brought him peace. My dad tells us that whenever he smells nail polish remover he feels extremely sick because when he was a toddler he drank his sister's nail polish remover and went to hospital. But then one night, I was up late chatting with my younger brother in his bedroom talking about our dad, and my brother tells me about a conversation he was either part of or overheard. Apparently, according to my dad, when his parents, my grandparents, were going through the Great Depression they lost everything as many families did. But it affected my grandmother horribly. Something must have snapped in her mind and she became a little bit insane. The real reason the smell of nail polish remover was so horrible to my dad was because one day my grandmother had decided that feeding my dad the nail polish remover as an infant in a crib was an easy way to kill him. It was only my grandfather rushing in and stopping her that stopped my dad from dying. Makes me wonder what sort of behaviors I might be prone to given some traits are more prevalent every other generation. I found out that my aunt and her family were in a cult for 10 plus years. Over the years of being a kid, I had always wondered why my cousins never came to family get-togethers anymore and why I never got to see them. My grandma would always tell me it was because they were reserved and liked their privacy. I always thought that was weird but never questioned it. One year, they moved from their home state to the state where my grandma and the rest of my dad's side of the family now lived. Now all of a sudden I was able to see them when I went out to visit in the summer, which I thought was odd. I also thought it was weird that they lived with my grandma and literally had moved out with nothing but a few suitcases. Turns out my aunt's family had been in a Christian cult for years and weren't able to leave it because they were threatened by the church. They told them that they would kill them and make sure they never escaped. They would keep track of when they went to the church on Sundays and Wednesdays. They were forced to give the church thousands of dollars a month just to survive. One day my aunt said she had enough, packed a few bags and booked it to the state my grandma lived in during the middle of the night. They left their furniture, a majority of their clothes, the kids' toys, almost everything. They moved in with my grandma and lived with her until they got back onto their feet. Now the oldest of the kids talks about it with me like it's nothing and how scary it was. They have been out of it for years now and have made a good life for themselves. I'm very happy they can't move on from what happened. My dad secretly named me after his one true love, not my mother. She was 12. He was in his late 20s. He told me the first bit when I was in my 20s, which was bad enough. When he died I inherited his papers and stuff and found out the rest, which TBH I could have happily lived without knowing. Apparently he was staying on and off at Greyhaven, Marion Zimmer Bradley's sort of artist pedophile commune, and he had named me after one of the victims in that whole crap show. She does look like very similar to my mom, and therefore to me. Guess he had a type. Marion Zimmer Bradley. Didn't hear about that when the news hit in, apparently, 2014. I'm going to be sick. Nobody can give me a straight answer on why my great uncle died before the age of 10. It's likely he died due to negligence, but everyone gives a different story. I am not sure if creepy is right, but in ways it is. My great granduncle fought in World War II. He never talked about the war ever, like ever. His wife knew nothing of it and she was married to him when he went off to war. Well, we found out after he died, at his funeral, that he was highly decorated. We found out some of his war stories, and one included that he was shot and thrown into a mass grave, presumed to be dead by the Germans, and 2 days later crawled out like a badass. This took my breath away. Holy cow. My parents are directly responsible for at least 8 deaths due to workplace accidents over the years. Indirectly responsible for probably hundreds more thanks to family interests in chemistry and mining. Grandparents on both sides were also more than a little helpful to the Nazis during World War II, resulting in a lot more deaths over time on side and a lot more $sign to the family coffers. I'm a descendant of one of the families from the Donner Party, the Murphy family. I told one of my history teachers in high school and she told me easily the most unsettling thing someone has told me. Those people your ancestors ate are still inside of you. That makes no sense at all, but it was so creepy to hear. Now that sounds like the perfect setup for a supernatural revenge thriller. That my aunt, my dad's sister, had an affair with the brother of her husband, and when he found out he hanged himself, and after his death they both harassed the wife of the brother so much that she drank poison and died. They live happily ever after. P.S. English not so strong, sorry. My great uncle, by marriage, had a one-night stand after high school that resulted in a pregnancy and baby girl. When he met, and eventually married, my maternal great aunt, she made him lose contact with his daughter. My mother's cousins have no idea they have an older half-sister. My mother only knows because my grandmother told my mom while she was drunk, and my mom told me while she was drunk. Man, alcohol does weird things. This isn't necessarily super creepy to me, but when I tell people they sometimes think it is. When my great-grandfather was younger, he ended up losing, I think it was like 7 or 8 fingers over the years. I think he lost 2 or 3 in war somehow. Then he lost the rest in an accident, but the ones he lost in the accident, he saved in this jar. Pretty much his thought process was that if he saved them, he could be buried with them, and presumably be whole in the afterlife. This is a thing in some religious communities, like certain ultra-orthodox Jewish sects. In New York there's a burial-specific company that's called in to collect bloody asphalt and concrete in the event of fatal accidents. And even the dirty water from a cleanup will be buried with the deceased, or so I'm told, so that all the blood is still with them. This isn't about my family, but my friends. Her grandparents were staying over at her house, and so was I. Her mum called me into the kitchen and said that the grandfather might try to get my phone number and that I should never give it to him. I pretended to throw up and went home. God bless your acting skills, TBH. Clever move. More sad than creepy, but before I was born, I think I was in my mother's womb still, my grandma had went into a deep depression and was getting ready to kill herself. She had written a suicide note to everyone including me. Thankfully she didn't go through with it and we ran into these notes a few years ago. I read a note she wrote to me and pretty much talked how sorry she was that I'll never get to meet her and stuff. Despite that she didn't go through with the suicide. It really made me emotional. She is now happily out of that nasty depression though. But honestly, she is the best granny any grandchild can ever ask for. Pretty much a second mother to me. After my dad died, my granny has been the second parent in this house. My mom goes out of the city to work and my grandma take care of the house while my mom is gone. I'm so glad this woman is still with us. Do you make sure to remind your grandmother how important she is, how awesome she is? I was always told my dad's cousin died from a bad reaction to a flu shot. He never got the flu shot and I avoided for many years. Thankfully I didn't catch it off him. Years later, especially with the rise of anti-science anti-vaxxers, I got one since I realized it's unfair to people who can't get and could easily catch it. I didn't get sick from the shot. Years later, I was talking with my aunt at a family party. They told me it was most likely AIDS that killed him. Coming from a very Catholic upbringing, he had to hide that he was gay. I never told him about hearing this from his sister. I'm still kind of pissed that I believed he would lie to me, but honestly, he's lying to himself just the same. Now I'm wondering if a lot of people are anti-vaxxers because of lies like this. Some people might be using the "my great uncle died because of flu shots" as a reason to not vaccinate, when in reality it could have been a very different story. Not creepy really, just funny. My mom and dad always said their wedding anniversary was in January and my older brother was born approximately 9 months later. When I became an adult I figured out they had to get married and never told us their real wedding date. They have both copped to this, but still refused to reveal their real wedding date. Well, when my father was cleaning out his mom's house after she passed, he found his parents' marriage certificate which gave their wedding date as 3 months later than what they told him. My parents got married in the late 50s. My grandparents got married in the late 30s. Like father like son. I found out our last name on my dad's side isn't our actual last name. Sometime before my great-grandparents on that side, my family was running away from Wales and they changed their name. All we know is that my great-grandmother said to my dad that they were evil people and you don't need to know more. She took whatever happened to the grave, and both my grandparents on that side are gone, so who knows. This has happened in my family also. My 2 ex-great-grandfather left Germany and changed the family last name. This has been a mystery since the early 1900s until my dad took a genealogy test last year and discovered a half-brother. This half-brother had the birth certificates of our family's long-lost name of it. You could end up knowing someday. When my cousin was 16 she had a baby with another cousin. The father's mother raised the baby. They have both grown up to have kids with other people and get married, and I never found out about it until I was like 18. I always thought it was strange because the child would call what I thought was his mom grandma and I had to ask my mom who his parents were. Their kid is now 25, has a few issues but otherwise lives a normal life. On my dad's side it's my grandma, grandpa, dad, and his brother, my uncle. My dad was the first to marry and I was born shortly after. I was the first grandchild on that side, or so I thought. When my uncle was younger he got a girl pregnant and she had a little girl. My grandparents refused, and still do to this day, to consider her their grandchild and forbid my uncle from being in her life since it was a sin since him and the mother weren't married. My uncle never provided child support, never helped, met her once in the hospital then once when she was 16 and that's it. He regrets it and feels really bad. I asked my parents why she isn't in the family and my dad said it's just how my grandparents grew up and they won't change their minds. One of my cousins is a decently known actress, and her husband the brother of a member of a very famous band, won't give any names for privacy reasons. Another cousin on that side got married to a former military guy who she brought to our annual family reunion. For nearly everyone there, this was our first, and my only, time meeting her new husband, and he seemed like a nice, normal guy. They divorced not long after that, for reasons I wasn't told then, and he was rarely spoken of afterwards. Much later on, I found out that my cousin's husband, at that reunion I met him at, became infatuated with my other cousin, the famous one, the moment he met her, and had started stalking her. He sent her hundreds of messages, emails, calls, started contacting her friends all the way in Hollywood, and near the end of his escapade, even started sending violent threats to her husband and his famous rock star brother. Eventually, after a restraining order and the threat of imprisonment, he stopped, and we haven't heard from him in years. My cousin eloped soon after that with another guy who seemed nice and normal at first, just like the previous guy, and then turned out to be a rabid neo-Nazi and KKK member. This marriage didn't last too long either. So I think it's a fair assumption my cousin doesn't have the best taste in men. It's not a secret yet, but I guess it will be for future generations. My family always was beyond boring and believe me, that is a good thing. Last summer, my older cousin, who became overly religious over the last 10-15 years or so, which is why most of the family lost contact, went to a hardware store, bought an axe, went home where she lived with her 30-year-old son. He always was a bit of a special needs kid and bullied a lot, as a grown up too, and killed him with the axe. Then she called the cops and confessed. A year later she is still in a closed psychiatric facility and it is very probable that she suffers from schizophrenia. She told her mother, who asked why she did what she did, that she only regrets not having done it sooner. Mom did heavy drugs since long before I was born. My grandma went to her apartment to clean it out for whatever reason, and she found a bunch of my baby bottles that had been turned into paraphernalia. Another time, my mom just kinda ditched me in the middle of feeding me to go smoke some crack or whatever. Haven't seen my mom for almost 10 years now. Sometimes I find myself wondering if she's made an effort to get better. My grandmother told me and my dad that we are related to Gavrilo Princip, aka the guy who shot Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife in Sarajevo, the event that started World War I. My dad, 45 years old, had never heard that before. We have lineage on his side from Eastern Europe and saw it after she did some DNA test. So yeah, my family basically started the First World War. You know, World War II is considered an extension of the first WW, so your family can take credit for it as well if you want. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.